How is everybody doing? And welcome back for another Strength Chat episode. Today, I have got a very special guest for you. Today, I'm joined by the creator of the Kabuki Strength coaching systems. He's got 3 all-time world record holders, as well as hundreds of novice to intermediate success stories to his name. Today, I am joined by the one and only Brandon Senn. How are you doing?
Hey, Stephen, really good. Thanks for having me on, man.
No worries at all. Thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on. How are you? What have you been up to? What's been happening in your world?
Oh, we've been pretty busy over here. Lots of growth happening at Kabuki Strength. We're hiring a few new coaches. We got some people shifting around, and new products coming down the line. I think, it's all pretty good.
Oh, nice. And for everyone listening, yeah, if someone's been living under a rock and didn't see the awesome event of the Kabuki Education Week, how did that go? Did it go as well as you planned? And yeah, how was sort of the aftermath of that?
Yeah, so we held an event called the Kabuki Education Week, which was kind of our alternative to hosting an in-person style conference. We had around 55 speakers over the course of a week present on topics ranging from nutrition, biomechanics, pain science, sport-specific talks, and many other things. And, it actually was a whole lot more successful than we thought. The turnout was fantastic, and the level of engagement from the audience was amazing. You simply can't get something of that magnitude, even in person. I mean, each presentation we had around 300 to 400 people attending them, and that's like 7 people a day over 7 days. So it was a pretty great event. Definitely going to try and repeat it in the future, and our goal was to lower the barrier to entry for higher level education from people who you wouldn't normally get an opportunity to speak with live, and you wouldn't normally get an opportunity if you are a personal trainer or someone like that who needs CEUs. You wouldn't normally get an opportunity to receive those credits for presentations like this. So for us, it was a fantastic event. The speakers, and with an event like that too, you never quite know what's going to happen from a technical standpoint. I think we only had one hiccup early on in the week, but other than that, it was great. We're going to be looking to do another one of those probably in the fall, and maybe a couple smaller events in between. But yeah, it was a great event.
Oh, cool. I know from being based over in the UK, and you see all these events that are abroad, and sometimes it's quite hard to manage your schedule and get to all these. So I know from someone who lived on Pacific time over here in the UK for a full week. It was a really good event to be part of, and it's good to hear that. I was going to ask, have you ideas to do more of that, because especially with the amount of people that attended, there's obviously interest for it there, especially with the changing dynamics of traveling and everything. And how did you feel, presenting rather than presenting in person? How did you feel sort of presenting online?
Oh my God, it's so much easier. I enjoy presenting in person. I like the interaction with people in live events. But anytime you present in person, especially if, in 2019, for example, we held like 13 seminars throughout the year. So we were traveling every month, and it was quite a grind, and it's challenging because in-person presentations is often somewhat of a performance. You have to have high energy. You have to be very engaged the whole day, and it's quite exhausting. Whereas if I'm just sitting behind a computer like this, I have my slides right in front of me. I don't get the same cues from the audience, like if they're retaining information or if they have questions. So I try to be outward and say, hey, you got to tell me if like things aren't clicking. But it's a walk in the park, honestly. It's so much easier. So I like in-person stuff, but the virtual seminars where I just sit behind a computer is honestly like, it's super easy.
Okay, because what I thought was quite good was at the end of the presentations, when you had sort of like the 10 to 15 minute questions at the end, which isn't as, like what you say, feeding off the audience a little bit, but there was still that opportunity there to have questions, which I thought was really good. For everyone listening, obviously did a little bit of an introduction there, but for everyone listening who might not know your background, how you got involved with Kabuki Strength, and your own involvement in coaching and training, just want to give a little bit of a background to yourself?
Yeah, I've been at I've been at Kabuki Strength since before it was Kabuki Strength. We opened our doors in 2015. Prior to that, I was contracting clients out of just the gym, which at the time was Elite Performance Center. That would have been like 2013, 2014, which is when I met Chris and Rudy, who are both co-founders of the company. And over time, I think when I came on, we had 3 employees, Chris being one of the employees. And we've grown over time. My titles changed over time. I started as just a coach working with Chris. I became head coach, and now I'm vice president of athlete experience at Kabuki Strength. I've had a really fortunate opportunity to work with a lot of really strong people, really talented athletes, and a lot of brand new athletes too. So I've also managed Chris's training from like 2017 to 2020. So I've written all of Chris's training, from his grand goals, training plans, his 1,000-pound squat, 1,000-pound deadlift, and other things. So it's been a fun experience to be able to work that intimately with him. It's been quite fortunate to have an opportunity to have an impact on the company like I have. And we're all trying to do our best around here, and we have a fantastic team. I can't say enough about the coaches that we work with. That's kind of that's kind of the high and low. We're kind of is an extension. I think all of our employees here, most of them, is kind of an extension of their life. So I think that's probably about sums it up.
Oh, cool. And one question that I always like to ask, especially from the coaches that I speak to, was coaching something that you always wanted to get involved in, and sort of who are your influences as a coach? Because especially with the experience that you have, and the amount of time that you've been coaching, I always like to see who your influences are, and who you've taken information from.
Oh man, who are my influences? I honestly, everybody. Huge ones early on were definitely Mike T. I can't say enough about him. When he first started publishing content around RPE, I was a very early adopter of that, albeit I was very poorly utilized it early on. But it really opened my mind to some other things. I was also, I kind of fell into coaching a little bit just because I enjoyed training, and coaching for me was a pursuit of my own self-improvement, and over time it just became more of like, it became an actual business. It's hard for me to nail down any one influence. I mean, I think there's so many avenues of resources right now that it's hard to nail down like a single mentor. Certainly working with our team here, I truly think having our team in person here at our facility is my biggest influence. It has been probably for the last 2 to 3 years. We have very bright coaches here, and it's very easy for me to talk to them about different topics, and when we can have a common discourse about anything related to strength sports, sports performance, training management, nutrition, pain science, movement, anything, we have a very quick feedback loop within our team. So I think that has really accelerated my own growth and understanding of really everything. But at the end of the day, I'm still a student, so I try to be as much of a sponge as I can. And in any situation that I'm in, I think almost anyone that I interact with probably has an opportunity to teach me something, and I try to sift through that as best I can. But I really like publications like the stuff that Greg Nuckols does. I think is awesome. I'm a big fan of a lot of the Research Digest stuff, because I don't personally want to go through and read all of these papers. So people that can distill it down and turn it into simpler information is fantastic. So I have probably too many influences to probably to probably know.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you there in terms of trying to read through a journal. I sometimes, look through, and especially with the maths that is done by Greg Nuckols, and how they put that into something that you can understand a little bit more. I sometimes wonder when I was at university how I managed to read journals and put that in there. So I agree with you on there, and as well. Especially with a group of coaches that I work at with the gym that I'm at, I think it's an undervalued. I can't think of the word. An undervalued thing to be able to speak to other coaches and bounce ideas off, because you sometimes see some coaches that have these influences and follow other coaches, but then sometimes don't have that person to, well, what do you think about this? What have you read something similar? So I completely agree. Having those ideas to be able to bounce off each other, I think is a really good thing to have. Obviously, we chatted a little bit about the Kabuki Education Week. Was lucky enough to watch your presentation, and diving into sort of the topics that I wanted to go through today was exercise selection, and the sort of train of thought that followed after following your presentation was. Can you just explain a little bit more about your thoughts on the traditional exercise selection and the traditional exercises that you see involved in strength sports, and your thoughts on the use of vectors and that thought process that you mentioned?
Well, I will say that it all depends on where you're coming from, right? So for strength sports specifically, I tend to think that, especially in the U.S., a lot of the culture surrounding that it was built upon bodybuilding and physique-based sports, and slowly as powerlifting and strongman and weightlifting and certainly CrossFit has become more popular, then I think the lens in which exercise is looked at for strength sports has become a bit more refined. I think, over the past 5, 10, maybe even longer than that, there's been a real shift from looking at just what muscles are working in exercises and looking at training movements, which I think is the best first start that anybody can do. I think you still need to look at in the lens of exercise, like there's many things related to that, and it really all depends on the question that you ask too. Because if you ask the question of, what does it take to get a squat better without any context of personal differences, it's a pretty clear-cut answer. But once you start layering in individual differences, even individuals' biases to movement, people's training age, and many other things, it becomes quite a bit more complicated. I've found, and I don't think it's quite as black and white all the time as just doing more of one thing. So I think the lens of exercise selection has changed over time, and I think that's probably a really good thing. We've seen, at least I've observed anyway, in the past few years, a real rise in higher frequency training within strength sports, which I think is overall a good thing. It's lend itself to training more of the actual barbell exercises, which I think is a net good thing for, again, I always try to be as intentional as I can is to say strength sports, because I probably don't have the same opinion when it comes to actual sport training. So if we had, a football player, soccer player, rugby, something like that, anything that I'm saying, I would probably change my mind quite quickly. But for strength sports, I think the overall trend towards more barbell training is definitely a good thing. And because of that, I think we've seen a rise in people's interest in improving their movement. Everyone's always interested in improving their technique, but once you start doing more actual barbell training, it's a little bit harder on the body. So people have to move a little bit better. They have to learn to stabilize their spine a little bit better. And really, when it comes to exercise selection, we have to look at what the primary drivers of successful performance in your exercise is. For strength athletes, that's going to be producing more force, and it's going to be transferring that force more effectively. So if we can boil it down to those two things, we can start to have a more common conversation, I think. I think when it comes to talking about exercises too, it's a very slippery slope into like people's personal feelings and opinions. It's almost as bad as talking about like training systems, which is kind of a whole other can of worms. If you talk to somebody about, I was just I'm rarely on Facebook or anything. I was on there the other day, and I saw some post of like, tell me why I shouldn't do West Side training or something. I had like 500 comments, and it was just brutal to read through. But when you read through it, you realize that no one's actually talking to each other either, though. They're just they're just kind of projecting into, the void. And that could be a limitation of a social platform too. But I happen to think that it's, much of people's understanding of program design or exercise classification, certainly it really stems from their own personal biases, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but you have to be willing to not hold on to those biases too much. Like, I'm very willing to be wrong because I'll just, change my mind with new and better information. And I'm always trying to operate with the best, newest information that I have. And I think when it comes to exercise, when we were doing in-person type courses and seminars, the first question that I like to pose to the audience is, and I think I did this in the Education Week presentation too, was, what constitutes an effective back exercise? And, the best answer to that is a follow-up question. It's like, well, for what? But, not many people think of that, and maybe it's a trick question, I don't know. But, people spout off in all kinds of directions. You get the people who say, well, deadlifts, obviously, and then people say rows and lat pull downs and all sorts of things. And certainly context matters. And so once we know that context matters, we can start to define what that context is, and then we can start to have a better discussion about it. But if you just ask for personal opinion about what is a better or worse exercise, I think it just gets nowhere, because with exercise classification or with program design discussions, you have to, before you can start the discussion, you have to establish a common language. And that was the whole intent of my Education Week presentation. And it's a presentation that we expand upon quite greatly in our advanced athlete preparation course, which is a 2-day course, is creating that common language. And once we can have that common language, which for strength sports is, for me, it starts with force vectors. So knowing how force interacts with the body within space, within various load positions, is like that. You can't really argue that, because it's a very simple, it's just physics. And so when you can start the discussion there, now we can start to have discussions about that, not just talking past that. And so that was the whole point of that discussion. And I think for a lot of people, if you have to be really interested in this stuff too to even go down the rabbit hole, because I would tell you right now too, it is not necessary to write a good program to know all about force vectors. If you just looked at movements and training similar movements, you would probably be about 85 to 90% of the way there. So to me, this is like more so progressing the conversation versus just finding the right answer. And so when we can start with talking about force vectors, and we can define how force interacts with the body in space and in various types of load, then we can begin to say, well, this transfers this way, this transfers this way, and it's very supported by the literature. So, I mentioned that I really like research reviews and things like that are easily digestible. But if there's a topic that I'm actually interested in, then I might start with the research review, but then I might dive in more to the specific sources. And, this is something that is pretty heavily supported from the literature. However, it is still something that's also progressing, because there's many other factors to exercise selection. Knowing how force interacts with the body in space is, in my opinion, like a starting point. It's like if we have a bunch of different buckets, we want to capture as much into one bucket, into eliminate as much variety as possible to begin with. We want to narrow down our selection of possible exercises that could work, and that's what force vectors are. It's narrowing down the amount of possible exercises that could work for this thing. For strength sports, it's very simple. It's if you look at a squat, it's similar squat variations. If you look at overhead pressing, it's similar overhead pressing variations. It can become a little bit more complicated, but it's really useful when you look at team sports, because if you look at like a player's motion analysis, and you can say, okay, one thing that we get into in the exercise classification talk is like, hey, there's probably a reason that sport coaches, American football coaches, have a lot of their athletes only squatting above parallel. Like if you ever see a video online that circulates any of these powerlifting social media platforms of like, a linebacker or an NBA guy squatting like a mile high above parallel, it's like, it's real justification for our sport because we go further with more weight. But the reality is that that's actually quite a bit more sport specific for that person. That doesn't mean that they should do that all the time. I happen to think that using full range of motion with ever increasing loads is like a really good way to improve the robustness of an athlete. But when it comes to actually improving these sporting positions that person's involved in, there's never a time, unless someone's getting up from the ground, that they move their hips below their knees in an athletic stance. And so that's like a really crucial thing to understand is, not all, squatting is the easiest example because it's almost universally implemented within training plans. But that's kind of where the conversation goes. But sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought because I was going on a little bit of a rant there. But the whole point of establishing, this first bucket, which to me is force vectors. So, like crash course on force vectors, if you think about the line of resistance and the line of pull of either a muscle or your body has, they should oppose each other. And the line of resistance is always going to be relative to gravity within a free weight exercise. And when you use machines, it changes quite a bit. But the line of resistance is going to be, or the line of pull rather, is going to be what you do as an athlete or as a lifter to oppose that force. And then once we know that, now we can begin to define different planes of motion. And it goes, I think a good starting point is like frontal and transverse and sagittal plane, but force vectors to me is a little bit better than just planes of motion because we actually factor in force relative to the body, not just how the body moves. And that's the distinction between those two things. And when we look at force vectors, we look at axial loading, we look at horizontal anterior to posterior loading, posterior to anterior loading. We can look at lateral medial loading, transverse plane loading, and many other things. And then we can begin to look at exercise as it relates to motion and combine those different force vectors and say, this is the combination of how force is applied to the body. Now we begin to start selecting exercises that are similar in nature to that. And that's a great starting point. But it's not the only thing, because force velocity matters a lot. Like, you can't just do the motion and get better. You have to match a lot of other things. And that's kind of where that discussion goes. But I'm probably being a little bit long-winded here. But the whole point of to me, to just kind of circle back without going too much further, I think the whole point of establishing that dialogue is so that we can have a common discussion about exercise. And I think that's really, really important if we actually want to progress our understanding and not just convince other people that we're right. If that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was a good explanation. And, picking out a couple of key things that you mentioned there is obviously to, before we start the discussion, we need to have an idea of what's the actual question that we're trying to ask. And what I took away from your presentation and what you're explaining there is, you can be a little bit more logical or strategic in terms of how you're adding exercises, rather than, there's that phrase of everything you put into a program has to have a reason. It's got to be a meaning for why it's in there. And as well, you've got to see how it plays, what is the best exercise for back, like what you mentioned. And, it's the purpose of it, which from I know for me, I like the whole programming side of things and how, you can manipulate variables and try and put things in there, make things as optimal as you can. And as you were chatting there, I kind of wanted to ask sort of when you hear phrases of, movements, not muscles, and them sort of taglines, do you think the concept of using these vectors and thinking about changing, what exercises and starting a little bit more discussion has started to be implemented a little bit? Or do you think we're focusing too much on, okay, so we need to address this in the squat, so we're going to try and use an exercise to, build bigger quads or build a bigger back? What sort of your thoughts on that, if that kind of makes sense?
Well, I'll tell you what, having bigger quads or a bigger back is never a bad idea. It really comes down to resource allocation, right? So if you spend all of your time only trying to get bigger quads, and you do things like leg pressing, leg extensions, if you do a little bit of front squatting, you do some split squats, you do some heel elevated stuff to really drive your knees forward, your squat's probably never going to go up. It's going to go up a little bit, but it's not going to go up that much. So I always look at it as a real real marriage between thought process, because there's certain time to think one way and a certain time to think another way. So when I have an athlete who's like really far out from competition, or if I have someone who's just interested in general fitness and looking better, I'm almost always thinking like movement first for like the first one or two exercises, but then it's like all muscle based, because there's still a time and place to think about what movements are training what muscles. And it is really important to know when muscles are working in movements. But I don't think most people are going to produce real productive training plans if they start there always. I think if you start there always, it's a very slippery slope into always doing rows and barbell rows and T-bar rows and never doing snatch grip deadlifts, never doing RDLs, never doing deficit deadlifts and things like that, because that was kind of where we got to with the question that we posed of like, hey, what's the best back exercise? And obviously I said, let's follow that up with another question. But if we look at strength sports, and we know that producing more force is better, net better, transferring force more effectively is also better. Those two things combined leads us down the rabbit hole of doing things that are more similar to our movements. So we should, if we want to improve our deadlift and we want to improve our force transfer in the deadlift, we should deadlift more. We should do deficit deadlifts. We should do RDLs. We should do snatch grip deadlifts. We should do things that are very similar to the thing that we want to improve. Now, if we want to improve muscle size, like that's still going to happen there, but there's a finite amount of that work you can do, right? So I'm not one of these guys who I probably used to be when I first started training. Like it was harder for me to understand some of the limitations of a lot of athletes. Like people can't just squat 5 times a week always and deadlift 3 times a week always, despite how good it might look on paper. Like I think anyone who writes their own training plan, sits down, they start writing it out, and then they're like, yes, this will definitely get me really, really strong. And then in week 2, they're like toast and they're trying to figure out a new plan. But sorry, I forgot your question, but I think it was something related to like, are people thinking more about muscles too much? Should they think about movements? I think you should think about both, but I think you should start the question for most people around movements or force vectors. Like if you aren't seeking out like deeper information about force vectors, I think that's totally okay, because I think you can get like 90% of the way there if you just look at movements. But what I don't want to see in a lot of training plans is establishing our first 2 exercises, and then we'll just kind of toss in whatever else we feel like. Like it's really easy in a program to put in like 5 sets of rowing, because it's just like, I have a little bit more time today. I can probably just add some rowing here. And, sometimes that's okay. But if you look at the week as a whole now, maybe we're doing like 30% of our work in like time allocation to like just junk stuff. And so instead of doing that, like, let's pick out maybe 1 or 2 things that's more specific to what we need to improve. And let's do those things and let the other stuff go. Like I'm also I go against the grain quite a bit too. And when it comes to even bench pressing, like I've been fortunate to work with a lot of really, really good pressers, people in the 500 and 600 range, and, people in the 200 range. And, they all have different needs, but I'm not going to say that I don't think back training is important for the bench press, but I think training your pecs, triceps, and shoulders is far more important than training your lats or training your rear delts. And I think that's something that a lot of people tend to miss when they just look at like common rhetoric, because I think we've all heard that like you should do 2 times as much rowing as you should pushing volume. And I got to ask, like, why? Why should we do that? I think for the majority of people, they don't quite have great control of their upper body. I think some of that is environmentally based, where a lot of us are slumping. Like I'm a strength coach and I sit behind a freaking computer all day. And so I'm always battling like a posture that somebody who works in an office 9-to-5 job, which I do work an office 9-to-5 job as I say that, but not 9 to 5, but yeah, I don't even know where I was going with that.
No,
I'm like, this is the first thing I've done this morning. I've had a lot of coffee before this.
Yeah, when you're saying there, especially, it's an interesting point that you're saying, right, we're going to add in more rows rather than looking at RDLs, rather than looking at snatch grip deadlifts, because, the traditional trainer thought is, right, okay, we're going to do deadlift or squat today. There's your main exercise. And then the usual trainer thought is, okay, so that's going to get you better at that skill. Right, let's now try and look at all the accessory exercises that are working around those muscles that we need to work. So we're going to work on back, work on hamstrings and all that sort of stuff. Do you think that sort of, rather than thinking of the traditional exercises, squat, bench, and deadlift as your main strength exercise, then having all the other exercises, thinking of, right, okay, so this is where we're going to build muscle, build hypertrophy, whereas actually, you should change it around a little bit, as though you can still target those muscles, still address those weak points with the snatch deadlifts or whatever it may be. Do you reckon that's a little bit more of a strategical approach in actually getting people stronger and allowing them to increase their total on the main lifts, rather than thinking about sort of the bodybuilding hypertrophy exercises?
Yeah, for sure. And there's always a time and place for both. So what I was kind of getting at, now that I remember where I was headed a few moments ago, when we talked about like people who are I tend to talk through the lens of a powerlifter or a strength athlete. When we look at people who are really far out from competition, I really recommend more variety than not. Like if you have like a really glaring issue or something, then maybe we need to get a little more specific. But I'm net like more variety is usually not a bad thing to an extent. But we get eventually to a point where just building a bigger base is not that useful, because you still got to go up, right? You still got to put a roof on the house.
Yeah.
And so when I've worked with some of these more qualified athletes, or not even qualified athletes, like people who are just stuck too, like people who are like really plateaued, we need to really get be a bit more objective with what you're actually including in the training program. Because like you said, a lot of people do sit down and they go, okay, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and then maybe Saturday, and they're like, okay, main exercise, and then they go accessory, and then they go supplemental, whatever, and then they feel like they have to fill those things in, and pretty soon they're doing like tons of rowing and a little bit of rear delts and some shoulders and maybe some hamstrings, and like things that are not ultimately that productive, whereas they should be doing like all of their, like if you're really stalling out in your bench press, like you need to do as much bench pressing as you possibly can. And what I mean by that is not just like what you can recover from, but like you need to do as much that doesn't like cause pain, like some pain tolerance in terms of like achy and naggy, like bicep problems or shoulder or pec problems. Like that's obviously your limit, but you got to do as much of that as you can if your bench press is stuck. And then your accessory exercises are not just, okay, some rowing and some rear delts and some biceps. It's like all triceps or all pecs, or it's like whatever else you can do with those really specific exercises. And that I've always referred to that as like unidirectional loading. I think it's something that I learned about a long time ago. It's been really hard for me to implement unidirectional type loading, because you always feel compelled to add more variety. You always feel compelled to add more rowing or to add more hamstring curls. Even like, why are we doing so many hamstring curls? Go and do as much deadlifting as you can first. Then if you still have a little time, maybe, but do way more deadlifting first. And so we have to really concentrate loading if we want to break through that plateau, or actually peak for a competition. We have to concentrate loading tremendously, but you can't do that year round. That's not a training style that you can implement year round and just say, well, if I only train triceps forever, like, yeah, your triceps are going to be huge, but you're probably going to have a lot of problems. So there's a time and place for a greater variety, for sure. And in my perception of a lot of other programs is it's way too heavy on variety too often. Like there's plenty of times in all of my lifters training, my own training, where we are doing rowing twice a week, and it's really heavy and hard, but we're not going to do that in like a competition prep cycle. Like we are really going to focus on the things that are actually going to contribute maximally to the bench press or to the squat or to the deadlift or whatever the exercise you want to improve is. So I think concentration of loading is something that's really hard for people to overcome, because they always feel compelled to do more. And if you can do more, great, but time is ultimately a limiting factor for many people. And so you have to consider that quite heavily. And then the opposite of unidirectional loading, or the other component that needs to be included in there, is maintenance style loading. And maintenance style loading is really hard to understand because it's something that should be included year round, in my opinion. So if you, for most people, right, there's no hard yes or no answers. Yeah. But maintenance style loading, like if you had a really productive strength cycle and you're like, okay, it's probably, you know, kind of burnt out a little bit, I should probably go to a hypertrophy cycle. Like, yeah, maybe you should. It's not a bad choice, but you don't want to give up everything that you just lost because it's going to take you that much longer to get back there. So, you know, if you're doing like tons of high rep stuff, I'm still going to do like 1x1 hard pin squat or hard pause squat or hard front squat, something that's not like ultimately going to test your real capabilities. It's going to be somewhat underloaded or somewhat mechanically disadvantaged compared to your normal competition squat. But we're going to do that like once a week just to maintain a little bit of an edge on the sword. And then once you actually come back to your, you know, concentrated style of loading, you're going to be able to progress way faster because you're not going to have to spend like an adaptive period of like a whole training block just getting back into shape. So that's, you know, that's kind of been the evolution of, I guess, my own training style, I guess, if you would call it. I don't even think I have a training style as much as just like trying to find the right combination of things for different people. You know, is kind of led me to that over time, and I think it's something that I think more people should probably adopt, is like certain times of the year. I guess to boil all this down, I think I'm being a little long-winded again, but to boil it all down is like, yeah, concentrate loading when you need to, and when you don't need to, like still add a little bit of it, but you know, don't be afraid to increase variety.
Yeah, I think you used a really good example with, you know, look, you know, the example of trying to increase your bench press, right? Okay, so what's the best things that we can do to actually increase your bench press? Because, you know, throughout you were saying that, you've got to think, right, what's the goal? What do we need to get out of this block or anything like that? And, you know, maybe not wasting time, but like what you mentioned about people, you know, time is going to be the limiting factor. If you're wasting your time on other exercises that aren't going to be the most optimal exercise for that person to increase their bench press, it's maybe not worth doing it. And then when you're saying there about, you know, the variation of exercises, I think sometimes, I don't know what your thoughts on it are, from a coach's point of view, they're wanting to change variation to keep the client interested, rather than thinking this is the goal of getting them stronger in this lift and we're going to do X, Y, and Z, rather than you know, trying to do a program and putting exercise in there that the client's going to enjoy. What are your thoughts on sort of, if you're putting exercises in there that the clients do enjoy, would it be at time? Would it be a certain point where you don't put exercises that they enjoy and you just focus on, this is the target that we're going to focus on? Or how do you kind of work with, you know, balancing that program that you're going to get the best results, but maybe not the most enjoyable, and actually getting the clients to be like, right, okay, we're going to put these exercises in just for adherence, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, that's always such a good thought. Like, that's really hard, right? So I think the thing that I would preface that with is that I don't think there's any wasted time if you're training hard. I just think there's more productive ways to spend your time. So there's slightly less productive training and there's slightly more productive training. I want to train slightly more productive more often. I don't think optimal really exists. I think more productive training does exist. I think optimal doesn't really exist because we don't really know. We don't have like all of the variables quantified, and we can't pull a lever on every variable. So optimal, it really can't exist. But when it comes to what someone enjoys, I think that matters quite a lot, especially for a lot of the recreational athletes. And I would consider almost every powerlifter a recreational powerlifter, because, you know, there's not many people who get paid to do it. So it's not like they're real, like people take it really seriously, which is good. But I think you always have to do things that the client enjoys, for sure. Yeah. If they don't enjoy it, then their adherence is likely to be low. They're likely to seek more things that are more soothing from a behavioral standpoint. So, they might lose some adherence on their nutrition or sleep, and they might just not enjoy it, which I think is, if people don't enjoy their training too, they tend to not try as hard. And if you don't try as hard, maybe you spend time in less productive positions. You let your knees cave in a little bit more. You just don't try as much. I think having a healthy dose of both is good. And I think the role of a coach is not just to be a programmer, but you have to understand that there's a human element to it as well. I'm pretty liberal in my decision making with the clients I work with, because we're always willing to have a conversation about it. So if one of my clients comes to me and feels very strongly that they should do something that I'm like, I don't think so. You can go one of two ways. You can go, no, like I'm the coach and you have to follow this, or else. And I think more people do that just because they're probably, somewhat insecure. I'm not saying I'm the most confident person in the world, but I would like to say, yeah, okay, I can kind of see where you're going with it. Let's just try it. Here's what I think though. And then in, 6 weeks or whatever, we'll come back and, usually we're talking through email or something we can timestamp, and we can go back and look and say, hey, here's the decision that we made. Here's why we did it. And ultimately, we're always going to be trying to make the best decision over time. So I don't think any one person has like the best answer, or, if a client also says that, hey, I would rather do this thing, you never know why they're saying that either. You never quite know if it's because they think it's going to make them better. Do they just enjoy it? Do they just want bigger legs, or what is it? So you always have to kind of understand that you're operating as a coach with incomplete information, just regardless of how robust your assessment process is or your information intake processes. You are always going to operate on minimal information relative to the total complexity that is the other person you're working with. So I'm always trying to make better decisions as a team with the clients that I work with. And, we're willing to experiment from time to time, but, there will be times too that I'm more willing to put my foot down and say, hey, no, I really don't think that's a good idea. Yeah. Most of the time when I'm going to do that is not really from a performance standpoint. Like if I have a different opinion about what's going to make more progress, I'm still probably only talking about like 1 or 2% more progress. Like it's not going to be like 15% more progress. So they might not even know it. But the times where I do that is if I think that the person's going to get injured. Like if I have somebody who's blown up their back deadlifting and, they just really don't move well, and they kind of, they don't really create great tension, and they're like, hey, I want to try this, deadlifting 3 times a week. I'm like, we're not doing that. Or we'll say, okay, let's do that. But, you're going to just be doing tempo work with 50%, and then you're going to do all of your normal training just to kind of satisfy them. But the only time that I really will put my foot down and say, hey, you really shouldn't do that is if I truly think the person's going to injure themselves, or if I think they are, because you can never say like, hey, you are going to injure yourself. You're going to say the probability of injury is going to become much higher. And if you get injured, regardless of if your training decision was right or mine was right, the productiveness of your training is going to be very, very low because you're not going to be training. So avoiding injury is like number one, right? So even if we have a less optimal program, I'm always trying to keep people healthy, and that's like the one time that I'll put my foot down. But it also depends on the level of rapport that I have with the person. So if I have, I don't take on too many new athletes these days, and a lot of my people have been with me for a few years, and those people, I have really good rapport with, and so there can be times where I can be like, hey, we just shouldn't do that. Like you should do this instead. And then, if they give a little bit, then we'll do it. If not, then we'll continue the conversation, and we'll, at the end of the day too, the person has to be bought into what you do. So even if they don't necessarily want to do it, they still have to see why they're doing it. And if they can't see why they're doing it, then I feel like you probably haven't done your job as well as you could have as a coach or as an educator or as a participant in the process with that person. Because I think coaching is there's a real difference between coaching and programming, and I think it's understanding the human element of the person that you're working with. And I really think that's something that our staff does super, super well here at Kabuki Strength. We only work one-on-one with athletes, and most of the time we're talking to them just like you and I are talking now. And it's always about coming to the best decision for that person and for us as a team, because that's ultimately what it is. Like, I want you to stay involved in my coaching. I want you to make progress, and I don't want you to get hurt. And so I'm going to do my best to get you there. But at the end of the day, it's like, both of us have to be on the same page more often than not to make this thing work.
Yeah, definitely. And you kind of took the phrase out of my head then when you sort of rounded up there of, the human element. If programming was as easy as, right, you input these numbers, you select these exercises, and then everyone who followed that program got stronger straight away, you'd maybe only ever sell 12-week programs at a time and have success. There is that, human element there, which I think, we chatted a little bit about the problem solving side of things. And I think it's important to realize, what is it they're trying to get out of the program. And a big thing which I think can be sometimes overlooked is the rapport and relationship that you have with clients, especially when we're looking at sort of, the online coaching side of things, when people are, you may be only communicating via email or text, and then having the maybe weekly check-ins over Zoom. I think it's an important thing to look at. Another thing that I wanted to pick on there is obviously you mentioned about sort of making decisions and the injury prevention side of things. I think sometimes and it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts. Or coaches are sometimes worried about or chasing to try and get it right all of the time, rather than thinking, okay, what's the best decision I can make with what we've got. And one of the things that you said there is we're willing to experiment with things. Do you think that's where coaches sometimes think, especially falling back on their traditional exercises of, right, okay, let's smash a load of barbell rolls and all that sort of stuff? Do you reckon that's where coaches may potentially go wrong sometimes?
Yeah, I think always trying to make a better decision is a good thing, but it's kind of funny. I really don't believe an optimal training plan exists for anybody. I think you can make better decisions, but I don't think you'll ever optimize it. And I guess it depends on the what question you ask, or what you think of optimized actually means. Maybe you don't actually think it's perfect. Maybe you just think it's a better decision. But even if you had a ton of data in front of you and you made a decision off of that, you would still be operating on incomplete data, because you don't know everything about the person on the other side of you. If you were able to, I even think if you were able to construct an archetype person and you defined every single variable, you would still not land on the quote unquote optimal thing. I don't believe that. And that's, I think the trap that a lot of coaches get into, and I was in very early on in my training experience, was, really trying to over plan and really planning for things that I didn't have data for. Like this is like a lot of people slip into this once they start looking at periodization models and different types of periodization. And they go, okay, for the first 6 weeks, it's going to be, hypertrophy, general development, and then I'm gonna have a transition week, and then I'm gonna go into like a specific development block, and then a strength week. And on paper, it's awesome, but you don't really know, 3 weeks from now what the status of the person is going to be, because even if you wrote the best training plan, it doesn't mean they even did that training plan. Like maybe they decided to, this is something that's so common that the client will come back and go, oh yeah, I was feeling great, so I just decided to test my 1 rep max. And testing that 1 rep max just flooded what you were planning from a fatigue standpoint. Like you are now well over your fatigue capacity. So all the other training that was built upon actually doing that it's got to be redone to some degree. So we rarely I used to write like 16-week plans and 12-week plans, and when I wrote them, I could see like the cycles within cycles, and it was like really like I felt like boy genius doing it. But it's, the more that you do that, the big problem is that the more that you plan and the more that you can if you go, well, if the person just does this, they'll do this, you feel very compelled to stick to that. One, because it's a lot of time. And as a coach, you still have to coach other people. And so if you over plan so much that you stick to that plan in light of new data, that's a bad situation to be in as a coach and as an athlete, because what's going to start happening is athletes going to report back less than ideal outcomes of training, and you're going to be like, well, let's just stick with it and trust the process. Well, the process sucked to begin with because you were operating on incomplete data. So whenever we write programs, we tend to look at it in a few different ways. We look at the big picture and we know where we want to get to. So that's our longer plan. It's kind of a direction to head versus a specific turn left, turn right here, take a left on 5th Street. It's let's just head north and let's make better decisions every single week and every 2 weeks, and we rarely will write a training plan that's or a small group of training weeks, more than 3 weeks. It's 3 weeks is almost a max for us, and even then we're it's 2 weeks and 1 week at a time. And we're always heading north and looking at data, but you just have to understand the best training organization doesn't really exist as much as it at least that's my current, where I'm currently at. And I've been on the extreme of the other side too. So who knows, maybe I'll swing back to something that's more formal from a long-term planning standpoint. I think long-term planning is really, really important. And what I mean by that is you can't just seek the closest gains possible. The big thing, if you were investing in the stock market right now, which GameStop's the big thing, right? And you're well, if I just put everything that I had on this, and if it did this thing, I would be a millionaire. But if it didn't do that thing, I'll probably be broke and living back with my mother. And that's the equivalent of if I could just sustain a 4 times a week deadlift frequency that was maxing out all the time, yeah, I would deadlift 1,000 pounds within a few years. But if I can't do it, I'm probably only going to deadlift 300 pounds because I can hardly walk. So I think I probably made that point just because I wanted to bring up GameStop, and I can't really remember what I was talking about.
No, I think that's when it comes to the programming side of things, I think that's where sometimes the confusion comes with when you're speaking about, right, we need a long-term plan for the athlete. But especially with it might be a little bit different for the elite level athletes, because they're going to plan their time a little bit more, because obviously they'll be challenging for records or titles or anything like that. Yeah. But for the majority of the novice to sort of intermediate and advanced lifters, life might get thrown a curveball. Work might be busy at some point. They're going to have holidays. I think a long-term plan, you can have a guideline of what we're going to do, but then shorten that down of, right, okay, how can we manipulate that? Especially when you're saying, especially with the 2 to 3 week plans, and that kind of goes back to the start. We sort of spoke about exercise selection, and I kind of want you to, come full circle with the programming side of things. When it comes to planning and, trying to take into account volume and stress placed on the lifter, do you have a bank of exercises that you use and you're going to dip in and out of to use, and depending on the time frame that they've got and how long you've planned in advance, or do you just make those decisions as you're communicating with the lifter?
Yeah, I'll definitely get to that. You said something though that I definitely want to bring up. You said something to do with advanced lifters being slightly different than novice, and you're exactly right. So I would say the caveat to everything I've said is there are some lifters that are willing to do anything. When I was writing Chris's training plans, there's only a few athletes that you should feel comfortable working backwards from a goal with, right? So if you have a novice athlete and say, hey, I want to squat 500 pounds in 4 months and they're a 350 pound squatter, it's like, yeah, I mean, we could try to plan it out, but it's probably not happening. But for like one of our really qualified lifters, one, their expectations are going to be a little bit better, but they're also willing to do just about anything to get there. So with like Chris, we could work backwards from the goals that he had and say, hey, I think these are like the timelines you have to hit and the milestones. And I could do that as a coach because I knew that he was willing to do anything. Anything from a lifestyle standpoint, anything from a nutrition, from a gaining weight standpoint, anything from even from a pharmacology standpoint. Like there are people out there who are going to do anything to get to that. So that's like the big caveat, right? But I tend to talk in more generalities because that's like everybody wants to be that, but they don't really know what it takes, right? Like just to speak on this really quick, and I'll get to your question. During some of Chris, and I like to use Chris as an example because almost everybody knows who he is. Yeah. But during those bigger training cycles that he would have, like he's not really even present from the company standpoint here. Like that's like his job now. Like he's sleeping as much as he can. He's doing as much body work as he can. He's doing as much movement work as he can. He's keeping his stress levels at basically zero until he trains that day, which is not that productive for other areas of your life. And so a lot of people look at like what he's done or like what any other really highly qualified powerlifter's done, but they don't really understand what that person had to do to get to that. And I think that's really important for people to kind of get around. But you said volume, stress, exercises, are there things, I think you were kind of getting at, is there things that I typically go to from like an exercise selection standpoint? Yeah, I think I have probably my own biases in terms of exercise that I found that I tend to use more often than not. So maybe I can go between, like, I guess to give people something to chew on, between, I guess my favorite squat, bench, and deadlift exercise. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah.
So I'd say for, squatting, it's definitely like more regular squatting. I'm a big fan of pin squats too. That's probably my next favorite exercise. In a mix between high bar pin squats and just regular low bar pin squats is definitely going to be my favorite. I do a little bit of pause squatting, a little bit of front squatting. I'm a big fan of safety bar squatting or transformer bar squatting. That's going to be like number probably 2 or 3 on my list. Just because you can do so much work and it's not going to beat up your shoulders or elbows. When, with the transformer bar that we make, you can change the loading position and it has slightly different impacts on the body. So if I was to pick like any 3 exercises, it would probably be like just regular squatting or high bar squatting, pin squatting, and safety bar squatting or transformer bar squatting. For the deadlift, it's definitely going to be, just deadlifts again, but it's also going to then be like deficit deadlifts, RDLs, and snatch grip deadlifts, and probably in that order. I really like deficit deadlifts because it's like a cheat code. If you can, for almost anybody that I've worked with, if they can get better at lifting bar off the ground in a larger range of motion, they're probably going to lift a heavier bar off the ground with a shorter range of motion. So it's something that's I won't use it if someone can't get into a good position, but if they can get into a good position, it's almost always going to be in their training plan. And then for bench pressing, certainly bench pressing, competition style bench pressing. I'm a big, my next favorite though is definitely going to be a Duffalo bar or a Buffalo bar bench press, something that, again, it's kind of like a deficit deadlift, but for your bench press. Like if your Buffalo or Duffalo bar bench press goes up, your regular bench press is almost always going to go up. Second to that is going to be like pin presses. I'm a big fan of pin presses. Close grip bench press, if the person like has good control of their shoulder girdle, like if I have someone who really dumps bad at the bottom of their bench press, we'll do incline pressing instead of close grip bench pressing. But if they can maintain that position, then we'll do a lot of close grip bench pressing. Then incline pressing is like a close, maybe 4th or 5th, and I like to alternate between low and high in terms of torso angle on the incline bench. So yeah, that's probably like if people wanted to chew on, what exercises I like, those are typically the ones that I like from like a barbell standpoint. From an accessory standpoint, it's probably quite a bit different.
Yeah. And are those exercises chosen to like what you mentioned there about not being able to beat up, their lifters' shoulders or anything, to be able to manage their volume and stress a little bit more? Or have you just found those exercises they seem to be the exercises that produce the greatest results?
I would say both. In the case of the safety bar squat or transformer bar squat, like if the limiting factor for somebody squatting is like debilitating bicep or shoulder pain, like we're definitely going to squat on a safety bar so we can train the legs more and so that they can bench press more, because if their low bar squatting is beating up their shoulders so bad that they can't bench press, like it's a lose-lose. So it's definitely like from a managing stress standpoint, and really it does come down to accommodating movement too. So accommodation, like we're always trying to improve an individual's movement, but we're always going to accommodate their limitations. So if their limitations are like within the shoulder girdle, and they have a really rounded posture, or maybe they really lack shoulder external rotation or quality shoulder extension, then yeah, we're going to safety bar squat, and we're not going to do really close grip bench pressing. We might do like high pins off the chest so that they can maintain position better. So yeah, we're always trying to accommodate positions. But when it comes to stress, like there's more things than just exercise selection that influences stress on somebody. So I don't factor that in too much unless we're looking at like just adding a few more accessory exercises in. Like I guess one thing that I would also add to that is huge fan of belt squatting. If somebody has a belt squat, I'm almost always going to use it in one form or another, or in one phase or another for their training plan. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, on a slight tangent from that, because a belt squat is definitely something that I want as addition to the gym. What are your thoughts on the variations that you can have? So having rather than an actual belt squat machine, standing on some platforms, having a belt around your waist, tying some plates and squatting down. I've also seen some people use a landmine variation of putting plates on. What's kind of your thoughts on those as exercises? Because it's still the same variation, if you like. It's just not the standard machine that people are used to. It's just kind of a slight tangent for what we were saying.
Yeah, I think I would probably tier it in. My favorite belt squat style is going to be a pulley system, so one that has a pulley underneath of you. I'm not a fan of bands underneath of you or anything. Like the accommodation of the force curve is really weird with these machines that use band resistance as the primary thing. I'm really not a fan of them, but I would say the machines that have a pulley based system as a direct pull underneath of you is number one. Number two is probably going to be lever based machine. So that would be the machine that Matt Wenning makes, a Pit Shark, things like that. The problem with those is they're so dissimilar to a regular squat because of the position they put you in, and because the amount of load that you can move is that they're not, in my opinion, a Pit Shark and the one that Matt Wenning makes is not that much better than just a leg press, to be quite honest. So I'm a real fan of pulley style systems. But if the person doesn't have anything, like I have a lot of people who use just a dip belt and weights. Like it's super effective. It's just a little sketchy to get on and off of the boxes. So yeah, if someone has a Pit Shark, we might use it, but I'm less likely to use it. I might do something like I can't even remember what it's called, where you have a safety bar on your back and you're holding on to pins, whatever that exercise is called.
Hatfield squat.
Yeah, I like those quite a bit because you can kind of maintain your position a little easier, and so I'll tend to do those before I would do something that's like a lever-based belt squat, just because I think it's a little bit more similar. But if someone has a really blown up lower back, then yeah, I'm going to use whatever belt squat they have for sure. Or if they really need accommodation.
Just like a little tangent on there, mainly because this week it just seemed as though I saw a couple of variations on there. Quite a lot of topics and conversation covered in that chat, Brandon. But the last question I kind of want to ask is, from everything that we've chatted about there and discussed, what would be your take home points or words of wisdom for everyone listening?
Words of wisdom would probably be to sleep more or eat better, whatever. For this conversation, though, I would say, I think the take-home point is, if you're interested in diving more into exercise selection, like definitely start to investigate force vectors, or just come to our advanced athlete preparation course, or just purchase the exercise selection lecture that I did for the Kabuki Education Week. You can purchase individual lectures, so go check that out. But I think, just if some of this was over your head, I think that's okay. It was over my head for quite a while until I really started experimenting with it and thinking deeper about it. And I still don't have all the answers, but I think if you were to boil it down to like one thing, like choose your priorities better, like try to spend your time more productively. Try to concentrate loading for your exercises a little bit tighter during specific times of the year. And don't be afraid to let like common exercises go by the wayside to make better decisions. And start thinking about movements or force vectors first, and then start to fill in all the gaps from there. So I think that's probably to round it out, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to round up, because especially from watching your presentation and speaking here, I think with anything, you get to a certain point and people get used to using things for a certain amount of time, and then it's thinking, right, how can we improve on this? And the common theme throughout the chat was how to make decisions, and having a little bit more of a thought process, and having a little bit more discussion about because ultimately the role of coaches and anyone involved in strength sports, whether it's powerlifting, weightlifting, or strongman, or whatever it is, the ultimate goal is obviously to get stronger. And any way we can talk about and have a discussion about taking those next steps, getting stronger, I think is key. So yeah, thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on the podcast. Really enjoyed chatting with you. For everyone listening that might have any questions about what we've chatted about today, or want to see the content yourself and Kabuki Strength put out there, where can people find you or reach out to you?
I don't do a whole lot on social media these days. I'll post a little bit. I'm only on Instagram too. My social handle is just Brandon_Senn, SENN. But if you have any questions about like this topic or anything, the best way to reach me is via email. It's just Brandon@KabukiStrength.com. I would also check out the content that our coaches put out on the Kabuki_virtual coaching page, or on our website. There's a ton of great content in our video library there.
Awesome. Everyone listening, 100% check out the work that Brandon does at Kabuki Strength. They put some really awesome content out there, which is really helpful, whether you're a coach or whether you're just a lifter looking to get stronger. So thanks again, Brandon, for taking the time to jump on the podcast. Really enjoyed chatting with you. Thanks to everyone listening, and I will see you all next week.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen.